At my niece's wedding, they placed my table behind a column. I smiled and left in silence. Then I canceled the payment for the party. If you're watching this, please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I stood behind the marble column, watching the celebration I had paid for through a veil of controlled tears. The golden lights of the Fairmont Hotel's ballroom cast shadows across my blue silk dress as I observed my granddaughter dancing with her new husband. Nobody noticed me here, the invisible matriarch, hidden away like an embarrassing family secret. This wasn't an accident. This was by design, their design. But they forgot who I am, who I've always been. The teacup trembled slightly in my hands as I carried the silver tray into the kitchen. Through the open window, I could hear Caroline and Rebecca chatting excitedly on the veranda of my Beacon Hill home. Their animated voices drifted in with the spring breeze. "So we'll have to clear out most of that old stuff," Caroline, my daughter, was saying. "The room desperately needs updating." "Do you think she'll resist?" Rebecca asked, her voice dropping slightly. I smiled to myself, heart warming at their enthusiasm. Perhaps they were finally planning that family trip I'd suggested months ago. Something to bring us together again, before my upcoming 80th birthday, the milestone that would mark the official transfer of the Sullivan Family Trust to the next guardian. "Mom barely notices changes anymore," Caroline replied confidently. "Besides, we're doing her a favor. That guest room is straight out of the 1980s. My smile faltered as I placed the cups down harder than intended. Not a trip then. They were discussing renovations to my home. Again. That evening, during dinner in the formal dining room that had hosted senators and diplomats throughout my husband's career, Rebecca clinked her glass for attention. "Grandma, we've been thinking about your guest bedroom." "Oh?" I kept my face neutral. Years of negotiation training serving me well. "It needs a complete overhaul. You know, for when we'll need to take over your house, Mom." She said it so casually, as if discussing the weather rather than my eventual decline. Jackson, Rebecca's fiancé, looked uncomfortable. "I'm sure that's a long way off." "Becca, 78 isn't young," Caroline interjected with a tight smile. "We're just being practical." Later in my study, I sorted through framed achievements, my Harvard teaching awards, photographs with world leaders, acknowledgement letters from presidents, thankful for my extraordinary ability to anticipate moves and build invisible alliances. Caroline had insisted I simplify the decor, claiming these memories were cluttering up the place. I paused at a framed letter from a former president. My fingers traced the glass over his handwritten note about my strategic mind. Where had that woman gone? At dinner the next evening, I tried sharing stories about our family history. "Your grandfather used to say that the Sullivan name opened doors, but it was character that kept them open." "Does anyone want more wine?" Caroline interrupted, smiling brightly, as if I hadn't been speaking at all. I cleared my throat to continue, but Rebecca glanced pointedly at her watch. "It's getting late, Grandma." Only Jackson seemed genuinely interested. "Please continue, Ms. Sullivan. I'd love to hear about the judge." "Thank you, Jackson," I said, noting how Rebecca's eyes narrowed at his encouragement. Later that night, unable to sleep, I wandered down for tea. Caroline's voice drifted from the study, door slightly ajar. "Yes, Mom's getting more fragile, but her mind is still good enough to sign papers. We need to accelerate everything before her 80th birthday." The teacup nearly slipped from my hand. My 80th birthday, 14 months away, was when control of significant Sullivan family assets would transfer, the cornerstone of our legacy, built by generations. I stood motionless in the hallway, heart pounding against my ribs, not from fear, but from a sudden, clarifying anger. The woman who had taught strategic negotiation at Harvard for 30 years hadn't disappeared. She'd just been lulled into complacency by the illusion of family loyalty. Returning to my room, I opened my drawer and withdrew my late husband's silver pocket watch. Judge Sullivan had carried it through countless trials, claiming it helped him see the moment when truth emerged in his courtroom. I needed to see truths now, too. As I closed my fingers around the cool silver, something shifted inside me, a dormant sense awakening. My family saw a fragile old woman fading into irrelevance. They had forgotten who Margaret Sullivan really was, and that would be their first mistake. 2 weeks later, Rebecca announced her engagement to Jackson Pearson amidst champagne and congratulations at my home. I watched her through new eyes, noting how her behavior shifted depending on what she needed: syrupy sweetness when requesting my credit card for the engagement party, rehearsed hugs when mentioning venue deposits. "Grandma, you look lovely tonight," she cooed, kissing my cheek while simultaneously eyeing the diamond brooch pinned to my dress, a Sullivan family heirloom worn by brides for generations. "Thank you, dear. The brooch will be yours to wear on your wedding day, as tradition dictates." I touched it gently, watching her eyes light up not with appreciation for its history, but with calculation of its value. The silver pocket watch rested in my handbag, its weight both comfort and reminder of the woman I once was: respected, powerful, strategic. "We should all go to the cake tasting together," I suggested during dinner. "Your grandfather had the most remarkable sweet tooth." "Absolutely," Caroline responded with manufactured enthusiasm. "I'll text you the details." 3 days later, I arrived at the prestigious bakery at the agreed time, only to find them already finishing up. The display cake models were being put away as I approached. "Mother, what are you doing here?" Caroline's surprise seemed genuine. "We had an appointment for the tasting." Rebecca's momentary panic melted into practiced concern. "Grandma, we rescheduled for this morning. I texted you. Don't you remember?" I checked my phone. No message. "We thought you'd decided to rest instead," Caroline added smoothly. "You mentioned being tired yesterday." I hadn't. The head pastry chef recognized me as he emerged from the kitchen. "Mrs. Sullivan, is that really you? I haven't seen you since the governor's fundraiser your husband hosted." "What an honor to prepare your granddaughter's cake." His sincere respect only highlighted the absence of it from my own family. The stark contrast twisted something inside me. "The decision's already been made, I'm afraid," I said pleasantly. Apparently, I needed my rest. Back home, I accidentally discovered a list that had fallen from Rebecca's planner during her last visit. In her neat handwriting, "How to handle grandma during wedding events. Keep her occupied with simple tasks. Limit speaking time. Avoid embarrassing stories. Seat with quieter guests who won't mind repetition. Position away from main photographer's angles. Age spots difficult to retouch. Have Caroline monitor medication schedule." My hands didn't shake as I read it. Instead, a strange calm settled over me, like the moment before a master chess player recognizes the path to checkmate. That evening, I found myself standing before my bathroom mirror, truly seeing myself for the first time in years. The elegant woman who had commanded classrooms and boardrooms hadn't disappeared. She had simply been gaslighted into believing she was diminished. "They think you're just a checkbook with a pulse," I whispered to my reflection. "A convenient ATM for wedding expenses with an expiration date conveniently set after your 80th birthday." I straightened my shoulders, noting how this simple act transformed my appearance from frail to formidable. The woman staring back wasn't ready to be written off or hidden behind columns. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Judith, it's Margaret Sullivan. I believe I may need some legal advice." The weight of the pocket watch in my hand no longer felt like nostalgia. It felt like a countdown. "Grandma, this means everything to me," Rebecca said, her eyes glistening with tears I now recognized as calculated. We sat in my sunroom a month after the engagement, Jackson beside her on the antique sofa I'd imported from France during happier days. "The Fairmont has always been my dream wedding venue," she continued. "But the costs are—" She trailed off, looking down at her perfectly manicured hands. "Substantial," I finished for her, noting how Jackson shifted uncomfortably. Caroline touched her daughter's shoulder. "We wouldn't ask if it weren't so important to Rebecca. The Fairmont has such history, such prestige. What they meant was such expense. The kind of expense that would significantly deplete my liquid assets before my 80th birthday. I've always wanted to honor the Sullivan legacy," Rebecca added, voice quavering perfectly. "To celebrate in a place worthy of our family name." The family name they'd belittled when they thought I couldn't hear. The legacy they dismissed as outdated when rejecting my stories. "Of course I'll help," I said, my smile not reaching my eyes. "The venue, flowers, band, and honeymoon. Consider it my gift." Rebecca's performance of gratitude was flawless: tears, hugs, exclamations of how I was the most generous grandmother ever. I accepted it all with the grace of someone who had taught negotiation tactics to future diplomats and CEOs, recognizing the manipulation for what it was. Later, As they were leaving, I overheard Jackson in the hallway. "Don't you think we're taking advantage?" he asked Rebecca in a lowered voice. "Your grandmother is incredibly generous, but—" "Stop worrying," Rebecca interrupted. "Grandma loves feeling needed. Besides, she's showing signs of cognitive decline. Caroline and I are just helping protect her from herself." I stepped back into the shadows, silent in my stockinged feet. "What decline? She seems sharper than both of us put together." "You don't see her daily like we do," Rebecca insisted. "She gets confused, forgets things. The doctor says it's early stages." My jaw clenched. I had no such doctor, had received no such diagnosis. When they left, Caroline called. "Rebecca went too far today," she said, sounding genuinely concerned. "The Fairmont, flowers, band, and honeymoon. It's excessive." "But you didn't stop her," I noted, keeping my voice light. A pause. "Well, she's set on this dream wedding, and you seemed happy to help." "I am," I assured her, fingers wrapping around the small recording device I'd received as a gift from a former student who worked in security technology. Very happy to help in exactly the ways expected of me. That night, I sat at my desk, calculator in hand, meticulously mapping out exactly how much the dream wedding would cost. Next to these figures, I wrote down the current balances of my accounts and the projected Sullivan Trust transfer value. Their manipulation wasn't just hurtful, it was strategically timed to deplete my resources before my birthday milestone. They weren't just dismissing me, they were systematically undermining my financial independence. I opened the antique box where I kept my most precious jewelry. Beneath the tray lay documentation of accounts, unknown to Caroline, investments my husband and I had made decades ago, quietly growing while I played the role of the predictable widow. The recorder sat beside my notes, its small red light blinking as I tested it. A simple device, easily concealed in a handbag or pocket. Designed for business meetings, it would now document family betrayal. "Begin recording," I said clearly. "Project Restoration, Day 1. My voice sounded different, stronger, clearer than it had in years. I hadn't realized how much I'd diminished myself to fit their expectations of a doddering old woman. Rain began tapping against the window as I worked through the night, developing contingencies, analyzing vulnerabilities, identifying potential allies. By dawn, I'd outlined a strategy that would have made my Harvard colleagues proud. I had 14 months until my 80th birthday, but wouldn't need nearly that long. The Sullivan legacy wasn't just money and property. It was resilience, it was strategy, it was justice. And I was about to teach my family a master class. 3 months before the wedding, I arrived unannounced at Caroline's house. The family sapphire brooch nestled in a velvet box in my purse. A tradition spanning 5 generations of Sullivan brides, it represented something I still foolishly hoped might matter to Rebecca. Voices drifted from the kitchen as I quietly let myself in with my key. I paused in the hallway, hearing laughter. God! It's exhausting having to listen to her ramble about Dad's cases for the millionth time, Caroline was saying. She actually tried to tell me about the judicial appointment again yesterday. "At least you can leave after dinner," Rebecca replied, her voice light with amusement. During the venue tour, she kept asking questions about accessibility. So embarrassing. The wedding planner probably thinks she's senile. After the wedding, we can finally stop pretending we care about her boring stories. Rebecca's dismissive tone made my heart constrict. I've been practicing my sad face for when we eventually have to discuss memory care options. Caroline's response froze me in place. "We just need to maintain appearances until the will is secured and the 80th birthday transfer is complete. Once the trust transfers, we can make decisions on her behalf." Jackson actually suggested inviting her to the rehearsal dinner head table. Rebecca's disgusted tone left no doubt about her feelings. "Can you imagine? Those event photographers charge extra for retouching." "What did you tell him?" "That her health might make such a long evening difficult. He bought it completely." My fingers trembled as I activated the recorder in my pocket, capturing every word of their calculated cruelty. I backed away silently, decades of self-discipline preventing me from confronting them. Knowledge was power. Reaction was weakness. I slipped out as quietly as I'd entered, the sapphire brooch still in my purse. At home, I sat in my study, the velvet box open before me. 5 generations of Sullivan women had worn this brooch on their wedding days, strong women who had weathered wars, economic collapses, and personal tragedies with dignity. Beside it lay Judge Sullivan's pocket watch, its silver case gleaming in the lamplight. I ran my thumb over the engraved inscription, Veritas Tempus Revelate. Truth is revealed by time. For the first time in years, I truly remembered who I was. Not just the accommodating grandmother I'd allowed myself to become, but the strategist who had once commanded respect in lecture halls and boardrooms, the woman whose negotiation tactics were studied at Harvard and whose counsel was sought by powerful figures. I'd spent years diminishing myself to avoid being seen as difficult or demanding. I'd accepted being interrupted, dismissed, and marginalized to maintain family peace. That ended tonight. I picked up my phone and dialed a number. Thomas? Margaret Sullivan. Yes, it's been too long. I need to meet with you about my estate planning. No, not next month. Tomorrow morning. Next, I called my bank and requested a comprehensive review of all my accounts and investments. Then my accountant, who sounded surprised to hear directly from me rather than Caroline. Finally, I called Dr. Winters, who had been my physician for decades. Margaret, wonderful to hear from you. How can I help? I need a complete cognitive assessment, Richard. Documented thoroughly. Are you experiencing symptoms that concern you? His voice shifted to professional mode. No symptoms, just family members who find it convenient to suggest I'm in decline. Silence, then a weary sigh. Unfortunately, I see this more often than you'd think. I can fit you in tomorrow at 2 p.m. I hung up and stared at the brooch, seeing not just its sapphires and diamonds, but the legacy it represented. I'd been entrusted with the Sullivan name, its resources, and its reputation. I had a responsibility to protect that legacy from those who viewed it merely as an inheritance to be seized. Outside, thunder rumbled across Boston's skyline as rain lashed against century-old window panes. I moved to my desk and began writing. Plans forming with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. They wanted the doddering grandmother who signed checks without questions. They were about to meet the strategist who had been silently watching their every move. And unlike them, I would not underestimate my opponent. I maintained perfect composure the next morning when Caroline called to check in after my unannounced visit to her home. I was in the neighborhood, I said pleasantly, but you weren't home, so I left. You should have called first, Mother. Her concern sounded genuine, but I now recognized it as performance. You shouldn't be driving across Boston alone. I took a taxi, I lied smoothly. My appointment with Thomas Harrington was nearby. A pause. Your estate attorney? Why are you meeting with him? Just routine updates. Nothing to worry about. I kept my voice light, aware that every interaction now was strategic. Rebecca asked about increasing the flower budget for the wedding. I told the florist to accommodate whatever she wants. The distraction worked perfectly. Caroline immediately shifted to wedding details, her momentary concern forgotten. After reassuring her that I was happy to cover the additional costs, I ended the call to prepare for my day of appointments. Thomas Harrington's office hadn't changed in the 20 years he'd managed the Sullivan legal affairs. The leather chairs, law books, and discreet photographs of Thomas with notable clients spoke of old-world reliability. Margaret, he said, rising to greet me with genuine warmth. You're looking well. Appearances can be deceiving, Thomas. I need your help. For the next hour, I outlined what I'd discovered and what I suspected. Thomas took notes, his expression growing increasingly troubled. What you're describing could constitute elder abuse, Margaret. Financial exploitation at minimum. I'm not interested in legal action against my family, I clarified. I want protection and, if necessary, accountability. We spent the morning reviewing my will, trusts, and powers of attorney. By noon, I had signed documents revoking Caroline's access to my accounts and establishing new protections that would be nearly impossible to challenge. The cognitive assessment with Dr. Winters will provide additional security, Thomas assured me. But Margaret, you should understand, if your family is planning what you suspect, there will be significant fallout when they discover what you've done. I'm counting on it, I replied, signing the final document with a steady hand. My appointment with Dr. Winters was equally productive. After thorough testing, he documented that I was cognitively intact, showing no signs of dementia or diminished capacity. The official medical record would make any claims of my decline difficult to sustain. Between appointments, I visited my bank, where the manager welcomed me personally, a courtesy extended to few customers. Mrs. Sullivan, we've prepared the account summaries you requested. I reviewed my financial position thoroughly, making several significant changes. New accounts were established with specific instructions about automatic payments and cancellation protocols. I arranged for large deposits to wedding vendors with an unusual structure, substantial amounts up front, with final payments scheduled for the wedding day itself. These arrangements are unconventional, the manager noted carefully, but perfectly legal, I finished for him. My perfect payment history and relationship with these vendors allows for some flexibility. That evening, I met with the wedding planner at my home, reviewing every contract carefully. "Mrs. Sullivan, we rarely structure payments this way," she said, clearly confused by my insistence on the unusual arrangement. "The vendors have agreed to the terms," I reminded her. "Final payments processed automatically on the wedding day, with a 24-hour cancellation option without penalty." She nodded reluctantly. "As you wish. Rebecca mentioned you might need some accommodation." "Did she?" I smiled pleasantly. How thoughtful of her. For the honeymoon in Tuscany, I arranged 2 sets of reservations, the official ones Rebecca knew about, and a second set in my name alone, both at the same exclusive properties, but with different arrival dates. Over the next week, I meticulously documented every interaction with Caroline and Rebecca, my small recorder capturing their dismissive comments and manipulative tactics. I noted how they excluded me from key wedding decisions while simultaneously asking for additional funds. I maintained my role as the compliant grandmother, approving every extravagant request with an enigmatic smile that neither of them bothered to interpret. They saw what they expected to see: an aging woman eager to please, not a strategist methodically setting the stage. At night, I categorized the recordings, noting patterns of behavior and particularly egregious comments. I wasn't building a case for court. I was assembling evidence of the truth, both for them and perhaps someday for Jackson, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with his fiance's behavior. The silver pocket watch became my constant companion, its weight in my hand a reminder of justice delayed but not denied. 14 days after beginning Project Restoration, I stood in my study surveying the documentation of my family's betrayal and my responsive strategy. Everything was in place. Now, I would need allies. The time had come to step out of the shadows and reclaim my place at the table, or perhaps, from behind the column they had chosen for me. "Margaret Sullivan, where have you been hiding yourself?" Judith Hawthorne embraced me warmly as we met for lunch at the Ritz-Carlton. Her elegant gray suit and confident bearing reminded me of the woman I used to be, the woman I was becoming again. "Apparently behind a convenient veil of presumed senility," I replied with a wry smile. Judith, my oldest friend and a retired corporate attorney renowned for her ruthless effectiveness, studied me over her martini. "Tell me everything." I did, watching her expression shift from concern to outrage, to calculating determination, the look that had terrified opposing counsel for decades. "They're manipulating you toward a crisis point, timed perfectly with your 80th birthday," she concluded. "Classic predatory behavior disguised as family concern." "Precisely, and I've secured the financial and legal protections needed." I sipped my water, still maintaining the appearance of the grandmother who wouldn't dream of ordering a midday cocktail. "But I need a social strategy as well." Judith's eyes gleamed. "The court of public opinion, always my favorite jurisdiction." Over lunch, we drafted a plan to reconnect me with Boston's social circles, the same influential networks from which Caroline and Rebecca had subtly isolated me over the years. We made a list of charity events, cultural functions, and private gatherings where my reappearance would be noticed. "The Henderson Foundation Gala is next week," Judith noted. "Several of your former Harvard colleagues will be there." 3 days later, I attended my first social event in months, a charity tea benefiting Boston Children's Hospital. I wore a tailored blue suit rather than the shapeless pastels Caroline subtly pushed me toward. The difference was immediately apparent in how people approached me. "Professor Sullivan, we've missed seeing you at these functions," said Elizabeth Cabot, whose family had known mine for generations. "I've been preoccupied with family matters," I replied, my voice stronger than it had been in public for years. "My granddaughter is getting married." "At the Fairmont, I hear. Quite the extravagant affair." "Yes. I'm covering the expenses as my gift." I paused deliberately. Though strangely, I seemed to have been positioned behind a column for the ceremony. Elizabeth's eyebrows rose. "Behind a column? Surely not intentional?" "One would hope not," I said with a meaningful smile. The strategic seed was planted. By the end of the afternoon, I'd reconnected with a dozen influential Bostonians and arranged future lunch dates with former colleagues. Each conversation included a casual mention of the wedding, my generosity, and my curious placement behind architecture. The following week brought an appointment at the florist for final wedding arrangements. Eleanor, the talented owner, greeted me personally. "Mrs. Sullivan, it's an honor to create arrangements for your family." As we discussed details, Caroline and Rebecca arrived unexpectedly. Their surprise at finding me handling arrangements alone was poorly concealed. "Mother, you didn't need to come yourself," Caroline said, kissing my cheek perfunctorily. "We could have handled this. I'm perfectly capable of discussing flower arrangements." "Dear," I smiled at Eleanor. "We were just finalizing the contract details." "Details?" Rebecca's voice sharpened. "What details? Payment structures? Delivery timing? Business matters?" While examining sample centerpieces, Caroline pulled Eleanor aside, thinking I couldn't hear their whispered conversation. "You'll need to confirm everything with me. My mother's memory isn't what it was. Her capacity is diminished," Rebecca added, not bothering to lower her voice. "We're helping her manage her finances." Eleanor's eyes flicked to me, then back to them. Her professional smile remained fixed, but something in her expression shifted. Later, as Caroline and Rebecca examined ribbon samples across the room, Eleanor approached me. "Mrs. Sullivan, I couldn't help overhearing." She hesitated. "My grandmother experienced something similar with my aunt. If you ever need a witness to your capabilities, please call me." I squeezed her hand gratefully. "Thank you, Eleanor. I may take you up on that." That evening, Jackson came by unexpectedly, claiming he needed to discuss a wedding detail. His obvious discomfort suggested another purpose. "Ms. Sullivan, I wanted to make sure you're comfortable with everything," he said once we were seated in the study. "Rebecca sometimes gets carried away with planning." "How thoughtful of you to check, Jackson." I studied him carefully, assessing whether he could be an ally. "I'm curious, what do you know about my seating arrangement?" His confused expression answered before his words did. "Your seating? I assumed you'd be at the family table with us." "Apparently not. There's a lovely marble column with my name on it." Jackson's face flushed with genuine shock. "That's not possible. I'll speak with Rebecca immediately." "Before you do," I said, placing a gentle hand on his arm, "consider what that conversation might reveal about the woman you're planning to marry." He left visibly troubled. Exactly as I'd intended. Strategic doubts planted in the right mind could be more effective than direct confrontation. That night, I reviewed my progress. Financial protections secured, legal documentation in place, social reconnections established, potential allies identified. I glanced at my calendar, where the wedding date was circled in red. 12 days remaining until the event that Caroline and Rebecca viewed as their triumph. They had no idea it would be mine. I picked up the sapphire brooch, tracing its intricate setting with my finger. 5 generations of Sullivan women had worn it with pride on their wedding days. Rebecca would not be the 6th, not yet. First, she needed to learn what the Sullivan name truly stood for. 1 week before the wedding, I requested a final walkthrough at the Fairmont Hotel. The wedding planner seemed surprised these details were usually handled by Caroline and Rebecca, but arranged it immediately. Sandra, the hotel's event coordinator, greeted me in the ornate lobby. "Mrs. Sullivan, it's an honor to have your family celebrating here. Your granddaughter's wedding will be spectacular." "I certainly hope so, given the expense," I replied pleasantly as we entered the grand ballroom. The space was magnificent soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, marble columns adding architectural distinction to the historic room. Sandra reviewed the layout, describing how each area would be utilized. "And this will be your table for the reception," she said, indicating a position on the floor plan. I squinted at the small circle marked "Family of Bride, Grandmother," positioned behind one of the ballroom's massive columns. "There must be some mistake," I said calmly. "This location appears to be behind a column." Sandra shuffled uncomfortably. "The seating chart was approved by Miss Rebecca personally." "I see. And did Miss Rebecca explain why her grandmother should be seated in a position where I can neither see nor be seen during this celebration?" Sandra's professional composure cracked slightly. "She mentioned, that is, there was some concern about—" She cleared her throat. "Miss Rebecca suggested that your visibility might distract from the aesthetic of the photographs." The words landed like a physical blow, but decades of negotiation experience kept my expression neutral. My visibility, my aging face, my elderly body deemed an aesthetic liability to be hidden away. I checked the silver pocket watch strapped to my wrist. How fascinating. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm terribly sorry. I can certainly adjust the seating. I held up my hand, stopping her. No need to apologize, Sandra. Some columns are meant to hide us. Others become the support we need when we decide to stand up. Her confused expression almost made me smile. The seating will remain as my granddaughter wishes, I continued. I have no desire to disrupt her vision for the perfect wedding photographs. Relief flooded her face, followed quickly by something else: respect, perhaps for my apparent selflessness. Now, regarding the payment schedule, I continued, I'd like to confirm the timing of the final transfer. Yes, as you arranged, the substantial remaining balance will process automatically at 8 p.m. on the wedding day. Perfect. And the cancellation policy remains as stated in our contract? Sandra looked puzzled but confirmed. Yes, you may cancel without penalty up to 24 hours before the event, though that's certainly just a formality at this point. Of course, just confirming all details. I smiled reassuringly. One must be thorough when spending several $100,000. Back home, I called Judith to set our final arrangements in motion. Everything is prepared, she confirmed. The car will pick you up at 8:15 p.m. on Saturday. Your luggage will be collected discreetly tomorrow. The tickets and reservations are confirmed in your name only. And the letters? Drafted as instructed, with copies of all relevant evidence attached. They'll be delivered Sunday morning to the specified recipients. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a surprising calm. The machinery was in motion now, all the gears aligned, all the timing set. That evening, I carefully selected what to pack for my impending journey. Not the matronly clothes Caroline had gradually introduced into my wardrobe, but items I'd secretly purchased online in recent weeks, elegant, age-appropriate clothing that reflected the woman I truly was. From my safe, I retrieved documents Caroline didn't know existed, investments my husband and I had established decades ago, quietly growing separate from the family trust. Funds that would now finance my independence and, if necessary, my family's consequences. I placed Judge Sullivan's pocket watch beside our wedding photograph on the nightstand. George had been gone 15 years, but I could still hear his voice clearly. Maggie, you've always been 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Don't let them make you forget that. My phone rang, Rebecca calling to confirm final details. I answered with the warm, slightly confused tone they'd come to expect. Grandma, just checking you have the right time for hair and makeup on Saturday. Yes, dear. 10 a.m. Perfect. And remember, blue looks best on you for the photos. The photos I'll be in? I couldn't resist asking. Of course. The family portraits before the ceremony. A pause. You'll be tired by the reception, though, so we've given you a more private table for your comfort. Behind a column, I stated flatly. Another pause, longer this time. Who told you that? It's not behind a column. It's just positioned for your comfort. The ease with which she lied was almost impressive. Almost. I'm sure you've thought of everything, Rebecca. We have, Grandma. It's going to be perfect. After hanging up, I finalized the last details of my plan. Every vendor payment structure verified, every contract clause confirmed, every escape route secured. I opened the velvet box containing the sapphire brooch one last time, then closed it firmly and placed it in my handbag. Not to give away, but to hold in reserve for a lesson yet to be taught. Saturday would arrive in 5 days. My family expected to see an aging woman, positioned conveniently out of sight, silently financing their celebration. Instead, they would learn what generations of Bostonians already knew. You underestimate Margaret Sullivan at your peril. The Fairmont Hotel glittered like a jewel box on the wedding day. Every extravagant detail executed flawlessly: the flowers, lighting, music, and champagne, creating exactly the atmosphere Rebecca had demanded and I had financed. I arrived precisely on schedule, dressed in a tailored navy silk ensemble that subtly communicated power rather than fragility. The antique watch was secured elegantly at my wrist, its weight both comforting and purposeful. The photographer barely acknowledged me during family portraits, focusing primarily on the bride while I was positioned at the periphery, present enough to fulfill obligation but easy to crop out later if desired. Mrs. Sullivan, you look lovely, Jackson said, approaching me while Rebecca was being photographed alone. Are you comfortable with everything today? Perfectly comfortable, Jackson, I replied with my enigmatic smile. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. His furrowed brow suggested he sensed something beneath my words, but Rebecca's sharp call for him interrupted any further conversation. Throughout the ceremony, I maintained perfect composure, the dignified grandmother watching her granddaughter's special day with apparent joy. No one noticed that my purse contained not just the traditional handkerchief and lipstick, but also the sapphire brooch Rebecca had expected to wear, and the small recorder documenting every interaction. The reception began with elegance and energy, guests marveling at the opulence that surrounded them. As instructed, I made my way to the designated table behind the massive marble column. From this vantage point, I could see portions of the celebration through narrow angles between columns, but was effectively invisible to most of the room. A waiter approached, seeming confused by my isolated position. "Mrs. Sullivan, would you prefer to be seated elsewhere? There appears to be—" "This is exactly where my granddaughter wants me," I interrupted gently. "And today is about making her happy." He looked troubled, but nodded respectfully. For the next 2 hours, I observed the celebration from my partial isolation, occasionally circulating briefly before returning to my assigned position. I noted how Caroline and Rebecca barely acknowledged me during these appearances, their attention fixed on impressing their guests. The father-daughter dance began Rebecca with her father, my son-in-law, who had always been polite but distant. I checked my watch, 7:30 p.m., 30 minutes remaining. Jackson approached my table, champagne in hand. "May I join you for a moment?" "Of course." I gestured to the empty chair beside me. "I wanted to apologize for this seating arrangement. I only discovered it yesterday. And Rebecca insisted it was your preference to avoid fatigue and commotion." "Did she?" I sipped my water. "And did you believe that?" His hesitation was answer enough. "I'm learning there are many things about the Sullivan family I don't yet understand." "Indeed. Some lessons come at greater cost than others." He studied me with new awareness. "You're nothing like they describe you." "No," I agreed. "I'm not." Rebecca appeared suddenly, her smile tight. "Jackson, they're about to announce our first dance." "I was just keeping your grandmother company," he explained. "How thoughtful." Her eyes darted between us suspiciously. "Grandma, are you enjoying yourself at your table?" "Immensely. The view is precisely what I deserve." She missed the edge in my voice, already pulling Jackson away. "We'll catch up later, Grandma." The speeches began shortly after, each one thanking the bride's parents for hosting such a magnificent celebration. Not once was I mentioned as the financial benefactor. Caroline caught my eye across the room during her own speech, momentarily flustered when she realized I was watching her take credit for my generosity. At precisely 7:55 p.m., I gathered my belongings and made my final appearance. I approached the head table, kissed a surprised Rebecca's cheek, and whispered, "Every Sullivan bride should understand the legacy she's inheriting." "Thank you, Grandma," she replied automatically, clearly eager to return to her conversation. Caroline frowned slightly. "You're not leaving already, are you, Mother?" "I've seen everything I needed to see." I squeezed her hand with calculated affection. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." As I moved toward the exit, Jackson called after me. "Mrs. Sullivan, do you need someone to escort you home?" "That won't be necessary," I replied. "I've made my own arrangements, as always." In the grand lobby, I checked my watch one final time. 18 p.m. precisely. I nodded to myself and stepped outside, where a sleek black car waited exactly as planned. "Airport, please," I instructed the driver. "International departures." As we pulled away from the glittering hotel, I removed my phone and made a single call to my bank's after-hours service line. "This is Margaret Sullivan. Authorization code Sullivan 1944. Please proceed with cancellation of all scheduled payments as previously arranged." "Confirmed, Mrs. Sullivan. All pending transfers have been canceled." "Thank you." I ended the call and gazed out at Boston's evening skyline, the city I'd called home for nearly 8 decades growing smaller behind me. In my purse, the sapphire brooch caught the passing streetlights, its blue depths seeming to shimmer with satisfaction. The first phase was complete. By morning, the consequences would begin to unfold exactly as I had designed them, not as revenge, but as the necessary lesson my family had forced me to teach. Behind me, at the Fairmont Hotel, the celebration continued in blissful ignorance, while automated payment systems throughout the city simultaneously registered the same status: transaction canceled by account holder. The following morning, while I was settling into my first-class seat bound for Florence, Rebecca and Jackson were enjoying their final breakfast at the Fairmont before their scheduled departure for Tuscany. Their honeymoon reservations, the ones they knew about, were set to begin that evening at Villa La Vedetta overlooking the Arno River. I imagined the scene unfolding as the hotel manager approached their table, his professional demeanor barely masking his discomfort. "Mr. and Mrs. Pearson, I apologize for the interruption, but there appears to be an issue with the final payment for your wedding." Rebecca would have looked up in confusion, perhaps thinking it was a minor administrative error. There must be some mistake. My grandmother covered everything. Yes, the initial deposits were processed months ago, but the final payments, scheduled to process automatically last night, were canceled by the account holder. Jackson's forkful of eggs Benedict would have paused midway to his mouth. "Canceled? I'm afraid so. Until this matter is resolved, we cannot complete your checkout process." I could picture Rebecca's face flushing with embarrassment as nearby guests pretended not to listen. Her frantic call to Caroline would have followed immediately, only to discover that the same situation was unfolding with every vendor the band. Florist, photographer, and caterer all reporting canceled final payments. My phone rang as my flight reached cruising altitude, Caroline's name flashing on the screen. I declined the call and switched to airplane mode with a small smile. The timing was proceeding exactly as planned. By now, Caroline would be arriving at my home, expecting to find me confused or perhaps ill anything to explain the mistake with the payments. Instead, she would find the house immaculately clean and conspicuously empty. The neighbors would mention seeing me leave with luggage the previous night, appearing rejuvenated and purposeful. Back at the Fairmont, Rebecca and Jackson would be experiencing the first consequences of years of disrespect. The hotel staff would insist regretfully but firmly that they could not leave until the substantial outstanding balance was settled. The honeymoon flight would be rapidly approaching, creating maximum pressure in the moment. Just as panic would be setting in, a hotel messenger would approach with an envelope cream-colored stationery bearing the Sullivan family seal in burgundy wax. Inside would be the first of several communications I had prepared. I reclined my seat slightly, imagining Rebecca's trembling hands opening that envelope while Caroline looked over her shoulder, both of them experiencing the dawning realization that this was no mistake. Meanwhile, my flight soared over the Atlantic, carrying me toward the Tuscan holiday I had planned, not the one Rebecca knew about, but the separate reservations I had made in my own name at the same exclusive properties, scheduled to begin 3 days before hers. By the time Rebecca and Jackson resolved their financial crisis and arrived in Florence, I would have already enjoyed the finest suite, the best tables at Michelin-starred restaurants, and the most exclusive vineyard tours, all while leaving instructions that the Pearsons be treated with respect, but not upgraded or specially accommodated upon their eventual arrival. A subtle lesson in hierarchies, delivered with elegant precision. The flight attendant offered me champagne, which I accepted with a smile. For the first time in years, I was acting as myself rather than performing the role they had assigned me. The liberation was intoxicating. In Boston, the fallout would be continuing to unfold. Caroline would be frantically calling my accountant, my attorney, and every financial institution associated with the Sullivan name, only to discover that my preparations had been thorough. No information would be released without my direct authorization. Thomas Harrington would be professionally sympathetic, but unmovable. Mrs. Sullivan left explicit instructions before her departure. I can confirm she is traveling by choice and is in excellent health, both physically and mentally. Beyond that, I cannot discuss her personal affairs without her consent. By afternoon, Rebecca and Jackson would be forced to use their own funds or credit to settle the considerable wedding expenses before they could leave for their honeymoon. Caroline would be facing uncomfortable questions from friends who had witnessed her taking credit for the lavish event, and throughout their social circle, the carefully planted seeds of my reconnection efforts would be bearing fruit. Speculation would be building about why Margaret Sullivan was suddenly absent after funding an extravagant wedding where she was reportedly seated behind a column. The final component of my morning strategy would now be in motion, the second envelope. While the first had gone directly to Rebecca at the Fairmont, another would be delivered to the Pearson home, addressed to Jackson alone, with instructions to open it privately. This envelope contained selected transcripts of conversations I had recorded specifically. Discussions between Rebecca and Caroline about my cognitive decline and their plans for managing me and my assets after the 80th birthday transfer. No accusations or explanations from me, just their own words, meticulously documented, along with a simple note: I believe you deserve to know the family you've married into. What you do with this information is your choice. The family china and crystal they'd used at the reception would still be gleaming under the ballroom lights when the first whispers began circulating among Boston's elite. Did you hear about the Sullivan wedding disaster? Apparently, Margaret canceled all the payments and disappeared. I saw her at the Henderson Gala last week. She seemed sharp as ever. Someone said they seated the poor woman behind a column after she paid for everything. By evening, my absence would be undeniable, my strategy unmistakable, and my message unavoidable. The carefully constructed narrative of the declining grandmother would be collapsing under the weight of evidence to the contrary. The flight attendant refilled my champagne as the plane continued eastward. In my purse, the sapphire brooch and silver pocket watch remained side-by-side symbols of a legacy temporarily derailed, but now firmly back on track. I raised my glass in a private toast to Judge Sullivan, whose favorite saying seemed particularly apt: justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Sometimes it's just being served cold. 3 days into my Tuscan sojourn, I sat on the terrace of Villa La Vedetta, gazing over Florence's terracotta rooftops and the silvery ribbon of the Arno River. The morning sun warmed my shoulders as I sipped espresso and reviewed my correspondence. Judith had sent a detailed email describing the aftermath in Boston. As anticipated, the canceled payments had created precisely the public exposure I'd intended: Rebecca and Jackson stranded at the Fairmont until personal credit cards were maxed out, Caroline facing uncomfortable questions from society friends, and my conspicuous absence fueling speculation throughout our social circles. The consensus, Judith wrote, is shifting rapidly from concern about your welfare to curiosity about what Rebecca and Caroline must have done to deserve such a calculated response. Eleanor from the florist shop has been particularly vocal about witnessing their dismissive behavior. I smiled, picturing Eleanor's righteous indignation. Sometimes the most effective allies are those who have witnessed injustice firsthand. Thomas reports that Caroline attempted to file a missing persons report, which was quickly dismissed when he provided evidence of your voluntary travel. He also mentioned that Jackson came alone to request a meeting, which suggests interesting developments in the Pearson marriage. I made a note to have Thomas schedule that meeting for after my return. Jackson's reaction would determine whether he could be salvaged from the wreckage of Rebecca's manipulation. The hotel manager approached with a silver tray. "Signora Sullivan, another message has arrived for you." I thanked him and opened the envelope. A brief update from my banker confirming that neither Caroline nor Rebecca had successfully accessed any of my accounts or information. Their increasing desperation was evident in the multiple attempts documented. The next phase was time to begin this morning. In Boston, Rebecca and Caroline would be receiving my formal letter, delivered by courier to Caroline's home, where they were undoubtedly strategizing their response to my disappearance. I could picture them huddled at Caroline's kitchen table, the cream envelope bearing the Sullivan seal placed between them like an unexploded ordnance. Rebecca would tear it open impatiently while Caroline watched with trepidation. Inside, they would find not an emotional tirade, but a precisely worded 4-page letter detailing their manipulations and my response. Accompanying the letter would be transcripts of their most damning conversations, copies of the medical assessment confirming my cognitive health, and documentation of the financial maneuvers I had executed. The letter would begin formally: to Caroline Sullivan Edwards and Rebecca Edwards Pearson. I write to formally acknowledge the dissolution of our previous familial arrangement. For years, I have accepted increasing disrespect, manipulation, and marginalization in exchange for maintaining the illusion of family harmony. That exchange has proven unsustainable. As you have undoubtedly discovered, I have withdrawn financial support for Rebecca's wedding and honeymoon. This decision reflects my desire to respect your clearly expressed wishes that I not be a burden or embarrassment to you. I have extended this courtesy to include removing my financial burden as well. Attached You will find documentation of your statements regarding my cognitive capabilities and your plans for managing my assets after my 80th birthday. I draw your attention particularly to the transcripts from April 12th, when you discussed accelerating plans to secure control of the Sullivan Trust. Let me clarify several points that may have been sources of confusion. 1. I am in excellent cognitive health, as confirmed by the enclosed medical assessment. 2. I have restructured my estate to protect it from the exploitation you were planning. 3. The Sullivan Trust provisions requiring transfer on my 80th birthday have been legally modified, with approval from the trust attorneys and board. 4. Your access to all Sullivan accounts and properties has been revoked. The letter would continue with clinical precision, outlining the consequences of their actions without emotional accusations. It would conclude with the only personal statement I allowed myself. For 30 years, I taught students that the most dangerous negotiation mistake is underestimating your counterpart based on superficial assessments. It seems my greatest failure as an educator was within my own family. I will be unavailable for the next 3 weeks as I enjoy the Tuscan holiday I planned. Upon my return, I will be open to establishing new terms for our relationship, ones based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. Until then, I suggest you reflect on what kind of legacy you wish to build and whether the Sullivan name means anything more to you than an inheritance to be seized. Regards, Margaret Sullivan. The final touch copies of this letter, delivered simultaneously to Thomas Harrington, Judith Hawthorne, and 3 other respected members of Boston society who had known our family for generations, not for legal action, but for social context. In Boston's established circles, reputation remained a currency as valuable as financial assets. I finished my espresso and stood, ready for the day's excursion to the Uffizi Gallery. My guide would be waiting, eager to share the Renaissance masterpieces with a client who had arranged for a private viewing of works normally inaccessible to regular tourists. This was the life I had earned and deserved, one of culture, respect, and self-determination, not hidden behind columns or marginalized to the periphery of my own family's events. My phone pinged with a message from the hotel's reception. Rebecca's scheduled arrival had been delayed by 48 hours. The notification brought no satisfaction, only confirmation that my strategy was proceeding as designed. I slipped Judge Sullivan's pocket watch into my handbag alongside the sapphire brooch. They would remain with me throughout this journey, symbols of a legacy temporarily threatened, but now secured. As I stepped into the Florentine sunshine, I felt lighter than I had in years, not from vindication or revenge, but from the profound relief of finally acting as myself again, the strategist, the guardian of the Sullivan legacy, and the woman who had spent decades earning respect that would not be surrendered without a fight. The game Caroline and Rebecca had initiated was reaching its inevitable conclusion. They had mistaken my patience for weakness, my generosity for obligation, and my dignity for an outdated concept they could discard at will. Their education was now well underway. The Renaissance beauty of Florence had worked its restorative magic during my 3-week sojourn. Each morning spent in galleries, each afternoon in historic gardens, each evening at exquisite restaurants had peeled away years of accumulated acquiescence, revealing the woman I had always been beneath the grandmother I had allowed myself to become. As my car approached my Beacon Hill home, I observed it with fresh eyes, not as the domain Caroline had begun subtly claiming, but as the Sullivan legacy I was still actively stewarding. The red brick façade and black shutters stood dignified against the autumn sky, a symbol of permanence in a city defined by history. Eleanor greeted me at the door, her concerned expression melting into relief. "Mrs. Sullivan, welcome home. Welcome. Everything is prepared exactly as you requested." "Thank you, Eleanor. Your assistance has been invaluable." Inside, the house gleamed with polished silver and fresh flowers, not the arrangements Caroline preferred, but my own choices of blue hydrangeas and white roses. Every room had been restored to my preferences. Family photographs and mementos returned to their proper places from the boxes Caroline had gradually filled with items deemed cluttering. "You've had several visitors," Eleanor informed me as she helped with my luggage. "Your daughter came daily for the first week, then every few days. Your granddaughter and her husband came twice. Mr. Harrington kept them all at bay, as instructed. And the other arrangements? Complete. The invitations were delivered yesterday, responses are already arriving, and dinner will be prepared exactly as specified. I thanked her again, marveling at how quickly one could assemble allies when operating from a position of respect rather than manipulation. Eleanor had witnessed Caroline and Rebecca's dismissive treatment firsthand and had eagerly joined what she called Team Margaret when approached. In my study, I found a neatly organized folder containing all communications received during my absence. Dozens of increasingly desperate messages from Caroline, several formal requests for meetings from Rebecca, and most intriguingly, 3 separate communications from Jackson, each sent independently without Rebecca's knowledge. I opened the most recent, dated just 3 days earlier. Mrs. Sullivan, I write to request a private meeting at your convenience following your return. The events surrounding the wedding have necessitated a significant reassessment of my understanding of the family I've married into. While I cannot undo my commitment to Rebecca, I find myself needing to establish my own relationship with you, independent of the dynamics I've witnessed. Your actions, while shocking to many, demonstrated a strategic clarity I've come to respect enormously. I believe we may have more in common than circumstances have allowed us to discover. Respectfully, Jackson Pearson Fascinating, a potential ally within the very union that had catalyzed this confrontation. I made a note to have Thomas arrange that private meeting after tonight's carefully orchestrated dinner. The dining room table was being set for 4 when Thomas Harrington arrived for our pre-dinner consultation. You look renewed, Margaret, he observed, kissing my cheek. Europe agrees with you. Freedom agrees with me, I corrected, gesturing him to a seat. Have the formal documents been prepared? He placed a portfolio on the desk. Everything as discussed. The foundation paperwork is complete. The trust amendments have been approved, and all accounts have been secured with the new protocols. Caroline and Rebecca have been completely blocked from accessing any information. And social developments? Thomas smiled wryly. Boston has been abuzz. Your strategic reappearance at key events before your departure, followed by your conspicuous absence and the wedding payment debacle, created exactly the ripple effect you anticipated. The narrative has shifted dramatically from concerns about your capacity to recognition of your tactical brilliance. And my guests for this evening? Caroline called my office 6 times today to confirm the meeting. She and Rebecca are approaching with extreme caution. Jackson seems to be positioning himself as a mediating presence. Thomas hesitated. Are you certain about tonight's approach? There are other ways to establish the new boundaries. The Sullivan way has always been direct confrontation followed by clear terms, I replied. My husband believed in addressing betrayal head-on, then offering a path forward for those willing to accept accountability. At precisely 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Eleanor showed the visitors into the formal living room where I waited, seated in the wing-back chair that had been Judge Sullivan's favorite, a deliberate choice that established the tone immediately. Caroline entered first, her confident stride faltering when she saw me. Gone was the fragile mother she had manipulated. In her place sat a composed woman whose posture and attire communicated unmistakable authority. Mother, she began, voice carefully modulated. You're looking well. Travel tends to invigorate rather than diminish me, I replied pleasantly. Something you seem to have forgotten. Rebecca followed, a conflicted mixture of defiance and uncertainty in her expression. She had clearly struggled with how to approach this meeting, her designer outfit suggesting she'd opted for confidence, while her nervous gestures betrayed her anxiety. Jackson entered last, nodding respectfully in my direction, before positioning himself slightly apart from Rebecca, a subtle but significant spatial cue that did not escape my notice. Thank you for agreeing to meet, Caroline said, attempting to control the narrative immediately. We've been very concerned about your impulsive actions. Impulsive? I raised an eyebrow. An interesting characterization of a strategy developed over months in response to years of escalating disrespect. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. Grandma, if this is about the seating arrangement, the column was merely the visible manifestation of my invisible status in this family, I interrupted calmly. A convenient symbol, but hardly the substance of the issue. I gestured toward the dining room. Shall we continue this discussion over dinner? I've planned a special menu. They followed me with visible trepidation. The table was set with the finest Sullivan china and crystal, each place meticulously arranged with equal prominence, no columns, no periphery, no symbolic diminishment. You'll notice, I said as we took our seats, that everyone is equally visible at this table. an arrangement I find significantly more appropriate. The first course was served in tense silence. I allowed it to stretch, observing their discomfort with clinical detachment. Caroline repeatedly attempted to make eye contact with Rebecca, while Jackson maintained a watchful neutrality. "I imagine you have questions," I finally said, breaking the silence. "Or perhaps accusations." Caroline cleared her throat. "Mother, while we acknowledge that certain misunderstandings may have occurred, your response was disproportionate and potentially damaging to the family reputation." "The family reputation was being damaged long before my intervention," I replied, "by the systematic undermining of its matriarch and the planned exploitation of its resources." Rebecca's composure cracked first. "You humiliated us. Do you have any idea what we've been through? The loans we had to take, the explanations to everyone." "I believe the word you're searching for is consequences," I interrupted smoothly. "An unfamiliar concept, perhaps, but one essential to understanding our new arrangement." I signaled for the main course to be served, then continued with calculated precision. "I've invited you here not to revisit grievances, but to establish the terms of our relationship moving forward." The terms I outlined over the remainder of dinner were non-negotiable. I had established a charitable foundation with a significant portion of my personal assets. The Sullivan Family Trust remained intact, but with modified transfer provisions. My financial support for family members would continue, but with transparent conditions and accountability. Most importantly, any future interactions would be governed by demonstrated respect rather than presumed obligation. "This isn't punishment," I explained, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "It's correction. The Sullivan legacy is not merely financial, it's ethical. I failed in transmitting that understanding, and now I'm rectifying that failure." As dessert was served, I reached into my handbag and withdrew the velvet box containing the sapphire brooch. I placed it on the table before Rebecca, whose eyes widened in surprise. "This belongs to Sullivan Brides," I said quietly. "Not as an entitlement, but as a symbol of the strength, integrity, and resilience this family represents. I'm offering it to you not as a peace offering, but as a challenge to become worthy of the legacy it represents." Rebecca's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the box. "I don't understand. After everything." "Some traditions," I said, rising from my chair to place the brooch on her dress myself, "deserve continuation. Respect is one of them. The question now is whether you're capable of learning what that truly means." In that moment, as the sapphire caught the light, I saw something new flicker across my granddaughter's face, not manipulation or calculation, but perhaps the first genuine recognition of who I actually was and always had been. The education had begun. 6 months after what Boston society now discreetly referred to as the Sullivan wedding incident, I sat in my office reviewing quarterly reports from the Margaret Sullivan Foundation for Women's Leadership. The organization I'd established with a substantial portion of my personal fortune had quickly gained recognition for its mentorship programs and strategic grants to women navigating male-dominated fields. A knock at the door preceded Eleanor, now my full-time assistant. "Rebecca is here for her meeting." "Thank you. Please show her in." The Rebecca who entered bore little resemblance to the entitled bride who had positioned me behind a marble column. Gone were the calculated expressions and manipulative tone. In their place was a woman who moved with cautious determination, her designer clothes replaced by a simple but elegant suit appropriate for the Foundation's professional environment. "Good morning, grandmother," she said, taking the seat across from me. "I've completed the financial literacy curriculum you recommended. The final assessment results are in my report." I accepted the folder she offered, noting the meticulous organization, a skill she developed during her mandatory 6-month probationary period at the Foundation. What had begun as my condition for rebuilding our relationship had gradually transformed into something neither of us had anticipated, a genuine apprenticeship. "Your progress is commendable," I noted, reviewing her work. "Thomas mentioned your questions about the trust structure showed real understanding." A flash of pride crossed her face before she controlled it. "I never realized how little I actually knew about wealth management or family legacy." "Few understand the difference between inheriting wealth and stewarding it," I replied. "One is passive receipt, the other is active responsibility." Our weekly meetings had evolved from tense obligations to substantive exchanges. The transformation hadn't been immediate or without setbacks. The first months following my return had been marked by Caroline's resentful compliance and Rebecca's defensive posturing. The turning point had come unexpectedly during a foundation event where Rebecca, assigned to minor administrative duties, had witnessed firsthand the respect accorded to me by academic and business leaders, many thanking me for mentorship that had shaped their careers decades earlier. "I never knew," she had admitted afterward, "about your impact beyond our family. No one ever told me." "You never asked," I had replied simply. Now, as Rebecca presented her analysis of the Foundation's investment strategy, I observed the emerging echoes of the Sullivan analytical mind, the same strategic thinking that had enabled my own success and that I had once feared lost to the next generation. "These quarterly results confirm our approach is working," she concluded. "Though I've noted some potential adjustments for the international portfolio in Section 4. Thoughtful recommendations," I acknowledged. "Would you like to present them at next week's board meeting?" Surprise flickered across her face. "You'd trust me with that?" "Trust is rebuilt through demonstrated competence. Rebecca, you're beginning to demonstrate it." After reviewing the remaining agenda items, Rebecca hesitated before leaving. "Jackson mentioned you've invited him to join the Foundation's Legal Advisory Committee. His expertise in corporate compliance is valuable," I replied neutrally. "And his integrity has proven consistent." The reconfigured family dynamics remained delicate. Jackson had established his own relationship with me independent of Rebecca, our shared appreciation for strategic thinking creating a connection that had survived the wedding debacle. Their marriage had weathered the initial crisis, but transformed into something more measured and conditional than the romantic narrative Rebecca had originally scripted. Caroline had taken longer to adapt to the new reality. Her initial attempts to circumvent my boundaries had been met with firm consequences, including temporary exclusion from family gatherings. Only in recent weeks had she begun demonstrating genuine effort rather than performative compliance. "There's a family dinner at my house this Sunday," Rebecca said carefully. "Mother has been working with her therapist on the issues you identified. She's making progress. I'm pleased to hear it. Please tell her I look forward to observing that progress firsthand." After Rebecca left, I moved to the window overlooking Boston Common, where spring had painted the historic landscape in fresh greens. Judge Sullivan's pocket watch rested in my hand, its familiar weight now a symbol of continuation rather than nostalgia. The doorway of my office housed no column to hide behind. The Foundation boardroom featured a round table where every seat held equal prominence. My home once again displayed the photographs and achievements that chronicled a life of significance. Small changes that represented profound recalibration. Eleanor appeared at the door. "Your 3 o'clock appointment with the Harvard delegation has arrived, Ms. Sullivan. They're eager to discuss the Joint Leadership Program." "Thank you, Eleanor." I smiled, slipping the watch into my pocket. "Please show them in." As I stood to greet my visitors, former colleagues now seeking partnership with my foundation, I reflected on the journey of the past year. What had begun as a necessary correction of family dynamics had evolved into an unexpected renaissance. Not merely the restoration of respect, but the establishment of a new legacy defined by purpose rather than obligation. Behind me on the credenza sat a framed photograph from the previous month's Foundation Gala. Unlike the wedding pictures where I had been positioned peripherally, this image showed me centered among 3 generations of Sullivan women: Carolyn, Rebecca, and Rebecca's young niece Emily, whom I was mentoring with particular attention. The lesson had been painful, but necessary. True legacy wasn't found in assets transferred or traditions maintained without understanding. It lived in the wisdom shared, boundaries respectfully maintained, and examples consciously set. As I extended my hand to greet the Harvard dean, an accomplished woman who had once been my student, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a strategist whose most important negotiation had successfully concluded. Not with victory over opponents, but with the transformation of adversaries into allies. The Sullivan family would continue, strengthened rather than diminished by its recent crucible, and I would continue guiding it not from behind a column, but from exactly where I belonged, at the head of the table I had built. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.